This week on The Other Side Australia, the economic woes that classical Liberals and Conservatives warned Australian voters about before the last federal election are coming home to roost. And it's having an impact on the political thinking of our young people for the better. It's the lesson they would only learn by going through the pain because they weren't listening to the warnings from the right back in 2021 and 22. We simply can't afford the net zero madness of the left, and nor could we afford the COVID madness of the Morrison-Frydenberg spending spree. We explain how and why it's all unravelling and what the future holds, because sadly, it's going to get worse before it gets better. We've got some good news for small business though. We'll show you how to stay afloat if you're facing a big tax debt. Radical Islamists preaching jihadi violence in Sydney, and they suffer zero consequences for it. But don't misgender anyone in modern Australia or the police will be right at your door. China gets a strong warning from our allies in the Asia-Pacific region as Japan's Prime Minister visits the Philippines. And the Greens walk out of the Senate. If only they'd stay out. G'day Melbourne, g'day Brisbane, and welcome back Optus customers. This is episode 231 of The Other Side Australia for the weekend commencing Friday night, November the 10th, 2023. And I'm Damien Curry, and this is your weekly summary of the best news and commentary that you might have missed so you can get smart for the weekend and the week ahead. This is the show that you should disagree with every now and then. Not too much perhaps, but every now and then's okay. All news shows are biased, and unlike the ABC, which is an instrument of the big unaccountable bureaucratic state, we tell you what our bias is right up front. We believe that centre-right traditional Aussie values of classical liberalism are the most accurate way to look at the world. That the world's not meant to be a utopia, and although we should strive to make it the best it can be, bigger and bigger government is not the way to get there. So we invite you to explore that with us and disagree where you will. We're not forcing you to pay for the show either, like their ABC does, but we love having you watch every week, so welcome. Welcome to the news of the week without the woke. And welcome back if you're on Optus. The worst corporate crisis management in the history of crisis management, I think, from Optus and its parent company Singtel this week. First, Optus insulted everyone by not explaining the situation of their big outage the other day, and the CEO, Kelly Bayer Rosmarin, appeared to have to be dragged kicking and screaming just to do her job and conduct a media interview. It took them 2 hours to even acknowledge what had happened with a text message to clients, 6 hours to do one media interview on ABC radio, and 12 hours for the CEO to front a TV camera. That's a performance worthy of being shown the door from any modern 2020s CEO. Chalk one up for gender equality. Ms. Bayer Rosmarin proved that female CEOs can be just as arrogant as their male counterparts. Her apologies came off as forced and condescending. She even ridiculed a small business customer's troubles during her interview with Channel 9's Damien Ryan.
I'm glad to say that services are now restored.
What do you say to your customers?
All we can say is sorry.
So you've apologised. What about compensation?
Now that the network is restored, we will have a look at ways in which we can thank our customers for their patience and reward them for their loyalty.
North Sydney barber Jacob Axa was forced to shut up shop.
I've had to turn back about 10 customers today. Basically, I can't use the register, so I can't charge customers.
I'm disappointed that a barber couldn't do haircuts today. That seems like one of the few things you can do without connectivity.
Then Optus rubbed salt in the wound by offering something that practically costs them nothing and that nobody wants as compensation: extra free data. Whoop-de-doo. What good is free data without a reliable network, you ask? Good question. Then, the next day, Singtel, Optus's Singaporean parent company, announced its first half-year financial results. Great timing, folks. Our customer-centric approach has continued to drive positive engagement, waffled Kelly Bayer Rosmarin in a written press release announcing a small revenue hike. She went on to say that she was truly sorry for the outage the day before, just by the way. Well, she could tell that to the board and the shareholders later, while explaining the inevitable drop that we're going to see in revenue that's coming as customers flee to other networks. Following the outage, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese had this to say. On your elbow. Well, another week, another interest rate rise, 25 basis points this time, or 0.25% for us normal people who don't work in finance, bringing the cash rate, that's the rate that banks can borrow from the central bank, to 4.35%. This in turn will bring most mortgage variable rates up to the 7% mark. Here's how Channel 9 News reported it.
The official cash rate lifting to 4.35%, the 13th interest rate hike in 18 months, and the first for new Governor Michelle Bullock. She's now the one taking it to 12-year highs, saying in a statement inflation is still too high, it's more persistent than expected, and the risk of it remaining higher for longer has increased.
Now let's stop all this nonsense about the RBA raised rates. It's the RBA's fault, not the government's. Economics is economics. Inflation is too high, and the only tool that governments have to get it down is interest rate rises. And as we've discussed on this show in the past, it's a blunt tool, more like a lever and a sledgehammer all rolled into one. The idea is to put the rates up to slow down demand, to stop us spending and buying and doing stuff, because high demand will make inflation worse by pushing prices up. But high demand only causes prices to rise when there isn't enough supply of goods and services to meet that demand. And there isn't enough supply because we've been mismanaging the country for a decade or two. And we really screwed it up with the utterly appalling overreaction that we had to COVID. Of course, the Treasurer tried to pretend it had nothing to do with government.
This will make life harder for people who are already doing it tough.
Within minutes, the Treasurer was again distancing himself from the RBA's decision.
That is a matter for them. I've got my own job to focus on. We are doing our bit as a government when it comes to addressing this inflation challenge.
But criticism was close by.
At the beginning of the year, Anthony Albanese said that his New Year's resolution was to get down the cost of living. It's November and it's only gotten worse.
Jim Chalmers has got his own job to focus on. That would be this job, Jim, this getting the interest rates down, getting inflation down. Now, there will be more rate hikes early next year, of course. The target inflation rate for the RBA is 2 to 3%. So they're going to keep going until they get there. Inflation is now at 7%. So we've got a long way to go. I've been saying for 2 years now that unless you can handle your mortgage sitting at around 8 to 10%, you should probably sell before everyone else realises they have to sell and the prices go down. Get out of debt. Get out of any debt that you don't think that you can handle at that 8 to 10% level. But I'm not a financial advisor, and this is the highly regulated People's Republic of Australia, so this is not professional advice. So make sure you speak to a financial advisor before doing anything rash. Channel 9's chief financial reporter Chris Kohler did the math on exactly how much more that people are going to be out of pocket.
Someone with a $500,000 loan can expect to pay about $76 extra a month. It'll be $114 for someone with a $750,000 loan. But if you add up all 13 hikes, those borrowers are now paying an extra $1,200 and $1,800 a month extra.
$1,800 a month, $22,000 a year, more than they were paying 18 months ago after tax. Where is Mr. Average Aussie going to find that kind of cash? And why isn't demand already throttled and the price of things falling, given that so many people will have less money to spend? Well, one reason is that our state governments and our federal government are going on a spending spree themselves using borrowed money. And that's pushing the price of everything up. They call it infrastructure spending. But a lot of it isn't really infrastructure spending. Infrastructure spending is when the government spends on roads and rail and bridges, things that will actually create more productivity in the economy by enabling business and people to be more productive. But up in Australia's fastest growing state, Queensland, the government thinks the Olympics is infrastructure spending. Is it really? They think, and I quote, that realising our future as a renewable energy superpower is infrastructure spending. That's a real sentence from a Queensland government website, by the way. Renewable energy superpower. Really? Also a phrase that Elbow likes to toss around, I understand. I'm sure that the people of Australia will just be happy if we can keep the lights on, thanks. Just focus on that first, geniuses. It's not infrastructure spending to indulge in pet projects trying to shift a state that could easily run on cheap coal energy to a power system that we don't even have the technology to make economical without government subsidies yet. It's completely irresponsible, in fact. Queensland's forecast debt by 2025 is $147 billion. And the Financial Review reports that the amount the government is ploughing into making Queensland a renewable energy superpower is $62 billion. The Olympics has blown out from $5 to $7 billion, so that'll definitely hit 10, you can count on it by the end. The new Brisbane Metro, the Cross River Rail system, which is actually good infrastructure spending, will be $10 billion when it's all said and done. And they want to spend $30 billion on other roads and rail, which is mostly much needed. Victoria's gone completely mad with the blowout of its main rail project. They want to spend $80 billion in the next 18 months. It's absolutely insane. Dan Andrews left the state completely broke and up to its neck in debt. $250 billion is the forecast state debt of Victoria by 2026. That's obscene. Think of the interest bill on that. And who'll be paying it off? The under 35s. The people who mostly, weirdly, love to vote Labor and Green. But they might be waking up to themselves. Check this out. This is a graph from the latest Essential polling, one of Australia's main social and political polling companies. It's a graph of the voting intentions of people under 35 from January this year to now. Take a look inside that purple circle. The red line is the Labor Party. The green line is the Greens, and the blue line is the Liberal National Party coalition. So after The Voice and the attacks in Israel, there seems to have been a big shift in consciousness among young people. Could they finally be waking up to the fact that the left have been selling them a pack of lies for a decade or two? And look at the cluster of independent and minor parties just down the bottom there on the graph. The orange line that spiked up at the end there, that's One Nation. The kids may finally be shifting to the right a bit, and not a moment too soon. You see, folks, no matter what side of politics you're on, we've got one very big infrastructure priority that we need to get right before anything else, and that is affordable housing. If we don't have affordable housing in Australia, and we don't, if young people can't aspire to home ownership and raising a family, then we are in massive trouble on every level: social, economic, crime, health, the lot. So to our governments, I would say this: rein in the spending. Spend only on real infrastructure projects that will help the economy grow and widen and strengthen. And put 80% of your attention on sorting out housing supply. Big infrastructure projects that have nothing to do with housing or roads just do not help fix this main problem. And they make the problem even worse, because big infrastructure projects might give political posers like Anastasia Palaszczuk a lovely PR photo opportunity, but they suck up all the resources, all the workers, which we don't have enough of, and all the materials, the raw materials, which we don't have enough of, and all of the government's money, which we really don't have enough of. And then that sends inflation even higher, making the housing crisis even worse. And then it also means that we need to bring in more immigrant workers, which makes the housing crisis worse. And around and around and around it goes in a big spiral downwards. So housing is priority number one, not net zero. I'm sorry. It's a luxury we can't afford right now, not becoming the renewable energy superpower. And sorry, not the Olympic Games either. Keep them very, very modest and very, very cheap. The focus has to be on housing. Now, the federal government knows this. They know they've got to massively cut infrastructure spending. Treasurer Jim Chalmers has told the states to cut back their infrastructure spending. And it's been a complete joy this past week watching a Labor federal government fight with the Labor state governments over cutting back on wasteful overspending. There's nothing more amusing to a centre-right Liberal like me than that. Pass the popcorn, folks. Watching the left squirm as reality bites them on the backside brings a perverse kind of kick, I've got to admit. But seriously speaking, it is so sad to watch our country go through such avoidable pain. Unfortunately, any politician that goes to an election saying that we have to cut government spending in this country is an easy target for left-wing parties. All they have to do is say, oh, evil Conservative wants to take away our nice freebies. And everyone thinks the Conservative is a creep. Humans aren't very good with delayed gratification and making short-term sacrifice for long-term gains anymore. But I think the voice vote did show that we are getting a bit better at voting with our brains and our heads instead of just our feels and our hearts and that immediate momentary feeling about an issue we might get. I really hope so anyway. And I really hope that the trend we're seeing amongst the young will continue. One of the most important sectors in our economy is small business. It employs more than big business, and it employs more people per dollar it earns than big business does. Small business provides the innovation and the disruption that a society and an economy needs to keep it on its toes. It inspires the individual spirit, the I can do it entrepreneurial vibe that really makes liberal democracies rock. It's why liberal democracies are richer than big government socialist or authoritarian regimes and have less graft and corruption and a much bigger middle class, much healthier economies. The health of small to medium-sized local businesses in any economy is a measure of that economy's health. Alan Jones had some scary numbers on that front this week in his Tuesday night editorial here on ADH TV.
The government won an election telling everyone in the electorate they'd be better off under Labor. Well, the number of companies that collapsed in October increased by 43%. Many of these companies see their tax office debt beyond their capacity to pay. Many of these companies earned nothing during coronavirus. They were put out of business by government. How can you pay your tax debt if the government doesn't allow you to get on with the business of making a quid? There were 569 liquidation or administration appointments nationally, 569 in October, 43% more than in October last year. New South Wales had 237 company collapses, Victoria 138, a Victorian increase of 79%. Now, behind every collapse are families who lose their source of income, employees who lose their jobs, and government loses tax revenue. Anthony Albanese can trot around the world shaking hands with whomever he likes. But Australia today is not the Australia that Mr Albanese inherited. On too many fronts, we're going in the wrong direction.
That's Alan Jones here on ADH TV on Tuesday night. Alan's show drops at 8 p.m. every Tuesday and Wednesday right here on ADH. Fred Paul on Monday at 8 and us on Friday at 8. So stay with us, a lot more to come, including later in the show an interview with two experts on small business insolvency who will be telling us about a plan that the ATO has for small business restructuring that you might not know about that can actually really help you keep your business alive and massively reduce your tax burden if you are carrying a lot of tax debt. That's coming up in a moment. Stay with us. A couple of weeks ago in Sydney, we had the protest outside the Opera House with radicals shouting, "Gas the Jews" and "F the Jews." The footage went all around the world. It was obscene, and it was a symbol of the level of anti-Jewish sentiment in Western countries. This week saw the emergence of a video filmed inside the Al Medina Dawah Centre in Bankstown in southwest Sydney. Brother Ishmael gave a sermon at after the October 7 massacre in Israel, and he told the gathering at that centre that jihad is the only solution.
But then when you go all around the world, including Australia, the one they talk about multicultural, respecting the Muslims, and that hypocrite Albanese, when he came and stepped and dirtied one of the mosques, saying and claiming and putting the mask of hypocrisy and lies to the Muslim that we love Muslims and respect him. Not long after, Allah exposed his lies when he said Israel has the right to defend itself. When he labeled Hamas as terrorists. Now we say to every individual who says about Hamas is terrorist, did you really forget your dark history? Did you really forget your ancestors, what they did to the native people in this country? How they killed them and how they killed their children? How they raped their women to change their color? Did you forget? Did you forget, and now the photo's still on Google, how you chained them like dogs? And you want to come and teach us about morals and humanity and what terrorism is?
The moral equivalency argument that really, when you scratch the surface about half a millimetre, isn't really a moral equivalency. It's very easy, though, to see the connection between the radical left and radical Islam. And in case you missed it, the socialists and communists in the Australian Parliament, the watermelons who are green on the outside and red in the middle, made the connection very, very clear for us all this week when the Greens staged a made-for-TV stunt by walking out of the Senate chamber after these wise words from New South Wales Senator Mehreen Faruqi.
The coalition is morally bankrupt when it comes to Palestine, and Labour has shown itself to be heartless, gutless cowards. You are watching the massacre of thousands of Palestinians by Israel, and you are not condemning Israel. You refuse to call for an immediate ceasefire. Well, we are not going to sit here and watch you pat yourselves on the back for doing nothing. Weasel words are not going to stop war crimes. Today, we bring the people's protest into Parliament. Free, free Palestine.
Thank you, Senator Faruqi. Minister Farrell, that was a statement, so order, order. Senator Hanson, order, order. Senator Sheldon. Did you want to respond, Minister? Sorry.
As one witty person on Twitter X this week put it, the biggest danger to Australia isn't the Greens walking out of the Senate, it's them walking back in. But back to Bankstown.
Now I say to the government, individual and personal, what George Brandis says in the Parliament House to Pauline Hanson when she came and started mocking the Muslims when she dressed with the niqab and the burqa. He said to her, there is 500,000 Australian Muslim righteous paying their taxes. Now by mocking their religion and targeting their deen, you are pushing them into the corner and you are creating a threat to the national security system. Now we say to them, by labeling Hamas as terrorist, by saying Israel has the right to defend itself, you are pushing the Muslims into a corner. We will not be silent. We will not back down. We will not stop defending our brothers and sisters in Palestine. And you are creating a danger to the national security system in Australia.
Brother Ismail said Allah will punish Muslims who do not stand up and fight for and help Palestine. Jihad is the way to heaven.
Our enemies don't know that. They don't know what's the meaning of jihad. Muslims, they starving for jihad. Their hearts are aching for jihad. They can't wait to be amongst the mujahideen and die in the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those words might scare a lot of people. What are you saying? The Asia will come and knock on your door. You feed them. When you meet Allah, who's going to be there for you?
Well, it seems that Brother Ismail doesn't need to fear ASIO or the Federal Police or the New South Wales Police for that matter, because so far none of them have done anything at all about this incitement to holy war in Australia's biggest city. The Australian newspaper, which first revealed the speech, says the comments are now the subject of a New South Wales police investigation. But what is there to investigate? The crime has been published for all to see. All they have to do now is enforce the law, don't they? Al Medina Dawa Centre itself has refused to condemn Brother Ismail for his comments. So they support everything he said. Okay. They even put up another video of another preacher later this week who cited Islamic scripture, which said, towards the end of times when the Muslims will be fighting the Jews, the trees will speak. They will say, "O Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." This second preacher also claimed that Jewish people had their, quote, hands everywhere in business and how they used wealth to gain authority over the weak. Now that's just anti-Semitic tropes. That's what that is. But I'll tell you something, mate, about people who get rich. It's a liberal democracy and capitalism that allows people to get rich. And it's not gaining control over people unjustly. It's how we sort out our hierarchy in free, democratic, liberal capitalist societies. You've got to work, you've got to take risk, you've got to make an effort, you've got to put your neck out. You get to choose how much you want to do that, by the way. And then if you succeed, you get the rewards and you have the hierarchy. Okay, it's a hell of a lot better than deciding our hierarchy based on who's got the biggest gun. or who shouts the most Quranic or biblical verses the loudest. The Jews have done well for themselves. They've done well for themselves by playing by the rules, just as many European people have done all around the world, and East Asians, particularly the southern Chinese Cantonese-speaking diaspora, who wisely escaped communism for that matter. And that's because our rules in the Western liberal democratic world are the fairest ever invented. And I assume that's why you're living in Sydney and not in the Middle East. And you're welcome here, but only if you respect our culture and its heritage and you play by the rules. When you look at the behaviour of the Greens and most of the Australian left, our ABC, our academia, you could be forgiven for thinking that we don't respect our own culture. And you'd be right. Way too many of us don't. But a heck of a lot more of us do. And a lot more of us are waking up every single day to the need to respect our own Western values and culture and understand them better and to not put them down all the time. Sure, our system isn't perfect, but liberalism has led us to a lot of positives. It's led us to a little bit of moral decline lately too. We need to fix that. Capitalism gets out of hand sometimes, so we've developed corrections for that. And there's more work to do on that front. But they're pretty good foundations. They're good systems. They are tried and tested, and they have been refined for hundreds and thousands of years. They're European in origin. Australia is a culturally European nation, and specifically Anglo-Celtic European. That is our heritage, the basis of all the systems of politics and economics and laws we have here. And these systems are pretty well refined. They keep the peace, which is something the Middle East might like to learn from. And they usually reward those who work hard and build capital and invest it wisely, and provide opportunity for those who would otherwise have none. Labour and capital, side by side with freedom and democracy, will build wealth and success. So you can't blame any group of people who assimilate, who respect the systems and play by the rules, getting successful. We welcome immigrants to this country, but assimilation is necessary, no matter what the left would say with their childish notions of multiculturalism and moral equivalency. No country on earth has got to balance things more sensitively right now than Germany. The country has slipped as the economic powerhouse of the EU. It's been losing ground to France because of its idiotic move to shut down nuclear while shifting to net zero too quickly, leaving itself open to over-dependence on Russia for gas. But Angela Merkel's other legacy of her reign was excessive immigration and refugee intake at levels that the society just couldn't withstand. Now, the country that has a deep sense of duty and penance for its past sins to Israel and the Jewish people is managing Islamist extremism within its own borders, and its Jewish community being persecuted yet again. The Vice-Chancellor of Germany, Robert Habeck, made an extraordinary speech about this last week that went viral.
It was a generation of my grandparents that wanted to exterminate Jewish life in Germany and Europe. After the Holocaust, the founding of Israel was the promise of protection to the Jews, and Germany is compelled to help ensure that this promise can be fulfilled. This is a historical foundation of our republic. Our historical responsibility also means that Jews must be able to live freely and safely in Germany, that they never again have to be afraid to openly show their religion and culture. But it is precisely this fear that is back.
Vice-Chancellor Habeck went on to mention that he cannot believe that Jewish people again feel unsafe in Germany almost 80 years after the Holocaust. He said the anti-Semitism is being seen in demonstrations and in statements being made and in attacks on Jewish shops and people. Kids are afraid to go to school and people are removing any religious symbols that they might be wearing for their safety.
People say that the context is complex. But contextualisation must not lead to relativisation. It is true that in our debate culture there is often too much shock and outrage, but here we cannot be outraged enough. What is needed now is clarity, not a blur. And to be clear, anti-Semitism is not to be tolerated in any form whatsoever.
And he also had a very clear message for German Muslim community leaders that the scale of pro-Palestine protests in Berlin and other German cities was unacceptable and requires a tough political response, and that this is also needed from Muslim associations and leaders. He said too few have distanced themselves from Hamas, and many have been way too hesitant to do so.
Muslims living here are entitled to protection from right-wing extremist violence, and rightly so. When they are attacked, their right to protection must be honoured, and they must also honour this right of the Jews now that the Jews have been attacked. They must clearly distance themselves from anti-Semitism so as not to undermine their own right to tolerance.
I'm just going to repeat those very wise words because they warrant repeating. Muslims living here are entitled to protection from extremist violence, and rightly so. When they are attacked, their right to protection must be honoured. And they must also honour the rights of the Jews now that the Jews have been attacked. They must clearly distance themselves from anti-Semitism so as not to undermine their own right to tolerance. I hope Brother Ishmael and all the radical Islamists here in Australia are paying attention. Now to some videos with a lot of wisdom in them as well. This one got 1 million hits on YouTube in just 3 days this week. It's author and social commentator Douglas Murray speaking on the Trigonometry podcast with Constantine Kissin and Francis Foster.
The Israel-Palestine issue, we've had people on the show to talk about it, but it's honestly not something that I have really paid a huge amount of attention to. I say that with some regret now, but nonetheless. What has struck me is I don't understand the double standards that seem to apply to Israel. I'd never really paid attention to, and therefore I haven't, but I don't understand. I mean, we're talking now about proportionality. And this is
they always do, as long as it involves Israel.
And I haven't understood what that means exactly, because I don't think Israel would want to go into Gaza and butcher innocent civilians in the way that Hamas did. And also, in a war, proportionality is moronic. You're trying to win.
Yeah, of course.
So why are people calling for proportionality?
Because they want Israel to lose. That's all. No, the international community always does this. There's, not much love lost across much of the world for Israel, for the same reasons as I described much of the Muslim world not having much love for Israel. Becomes the whipping boy, the scapegoat of the international community. The joke that the UN should have a football team. They would say, well, who would they play? Israel, obviously.
Murray discussed the vote in the United Nations that happened right after October 7, calling for the condemnation of the attack by Hamas on Israel.
It didn't pass. Didn't pass. The UN couldn't bring itself to vote to condemn the massacre of the 7th of October. And when it was announced in the hall that it hadn't passed, there was much whooping and clapping. Now, we've seen this before, of course. In 1975, there was a resolution at the United Nations in New York that Zionism is racism. One of those proposing this motion was Idi Amin, fine, upstanding gentleman.
A good guy.
Yeah. And again, people watching who don't know who Idi Amin is, educate yourself. And the evening that the vote was put to the UN, a drinks reception was held at the United Nations for those voting that Zionism was racism. And who was hosting the drinks party? Kurt Waldheim. Again, people can look him up. Kurt Waldheim is the former Chancellor of Austria. He was a member of an SS battalion in World War II. So, the United Nations has been here before, plenty of times. The United Nations can never bring itself to condemn anything unless it involves Israel.
But it's not just in the United Nations. Why do so many people on both the political left and our own side of politics dislike the Jews? Douglas Murray has this theory.
At one point in the history of Europe, in the history of our own country, the Jews were hated because they were poor, and then they were hated because they were rich. They were hated for not integrating, and then they were hated for integrating. In the era where you could hate people for their religion, they were hated for their religion. Then when that became impossible in Europe, you couldn't hate people for their religion, they were hated for their race. Then at a particular point in Europe, we discovered we couldn't hate people for their race anymore. So what did we hate people for if they were Jewish? We hated them for being stateless. Then the Jewish people got a state, and they were hated for having a state. Now, you cannot tell me in this situation that there's a coincidence here. It tells you about the person who suffers from it, not about the Jews. He says, tell me what you accuse the Jews of. I'll tell you what you're guilty of. People who hate the Jews for being religious have religious problems themselves. People who hate the fact that Jews have a state that they're willing to defend have a problem with defending their own state themselves, and much, much more, on and on and on.
Douglas Murray on the Trigonometry podcast this week. The host of Trigonometry, Konstantin Kissin's speech at the ARC conference in London last week was perhaps the standout presentation of the whole event. ARC, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, is a new organisation co-founded by Jordan Peterson that could become a counter-voice to Klaus Schwab's annual WEF event, which pushes a globalist, big corporate, big government worldview. ARC is all about classical liberal values, small business and small government. You can catch most of the best speeches from ARC right here on ADH TV, adh.tv on any web browser. Please join us if you're not there already. Anyway, I promised last week that in each episode of The Other Side Australia until the end of the year, we'll be exploring one of the speeches from ARC, at least in depth. Given his great work as a social and political commentator, Konstantin Kissin is, it's easy to forget that he started public life actually as a comedian.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said that the strength or weakness of a society depends more on the level of its spiritual life than on its level of industrialization. If a nation's spiritual energies have been exhausted, he said, it will not be saved from collapse by the most perfect government structure or by any industrial development. A tree with a rotten core cannot stand. When he was allowed to leave the USSR, Solzhenitsyn went to the US, where he was given a hero's welcome. But he quickly realized that American society was far from perfect. He started lecturing Americans about the problems he saw. Americans don't like that. Like Solzhenitsyn, I come from the Soviet Union, but I have no intention of repeating his mistake. That's why I've come to Britain. Where you love being told what's wrong with you by foreigners.
Let that one sink in for a second. Kissin went on to more serious matters then, saying that the events of the past month have been depressing and that, like many of us, he genuinely wonders how long Western civilization will survive.
For years now, many of us have been warning that the barbarians are at the gates. We were wrong. They're inside. Now, look, I'm not going to be all doom and gloom. There are positives as well. I mean, say what you want about Hamas supporters, at least they know what a woman is.
Konstantin spoke of his 16-month-old son, Nikolai, and his insistence that his father plays with him whenever he wants.
He sits on my hip and points in the direction he wants to go. Treats me like a horse, basically. And if I don't act quickly enough or if I don't comply, he does what all toddlers do. He throws a tantrum and starts screaming. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams with your empty words. And when he does, we read him a story and put him to bed. We don't give him a standing ovation in front of the UN.
Kissin told the conference that the story of the West is a story of audacity.
The big debates of the last decade, the culture war, the polarization, are about one thing and one thing only: the future. There are people like us in this room who believe that our future is to be prosperous, powerful, and influential. We are the majority. But there are also some people whose brains have been broken by an excess of education, who believe that our history is evil, that we do not deserve to be great, we do not deserve to be powerful, that we must be punished for the sins of our ancestors. To them, our past is abominable, Our present must be spent apologising, and our future is managed decline. My message to those people is simple. How dare you? You will not steal my son's dreams with your empty words.
Konstantin Kisin reminded the ARC conference that we must be positive and hold on to the positives of what Western civilization has created.
This morning, I destroyed someone on Twitter with facts and logic from the toilet. It's magic. Remember your grandparents? Remember them? If I could go back in time and transport the grandparents of your grandparents into this room, just 4 generations ago, they would think they'd been abducted by aliens. That's the progress we've made. We haven't made that progress by whining and acting like victims. We've made that progress by unleashing the creativity and talents of people like us here in this room.
One of the points I made on social media and Discernible and other platforms after the loss in the 2020 federal election was that the left wing in Australia, Labor and the Greens and the unions have got both capital and Labor on their side. That's dangerous. For a liberal democratic capitalist society to survive, there needs to be a healthy tension between the forces of Labor and the forces of capital. But big business backs Labor because big business has worked out that big government bureaucracy could be its best friend in helping to crush the little guys, small and medium-sized business, the rebels and the innovators and change agents who disrupt the status quo every so often in a healthy way to spark renewal, the producers who create true progress for our nation, not the administrators who seek only power and control. For a liberal democracy to survive, capital must support liberal democratic ideas and political and cultural forces. And capital in Australia has deserted centre-right values. We saw it with the Voice referendum too. Tens of millions of corporate dollars being funneled into the Yes campaign. And lawfare now with the proposed misinformation and disinformation laws aiming to stifle the voices of the centre-right even more. Many businesses in Australia give to all political parties to hedge their bets. Well, you can't hedge your bets in business. The left wants to destroy you. They want the government to own and control almost everything and the bureaucracy to wield power over every bit of the economy. We are way out of balance. Business has got to channel its capital in the right direction for a while. It needs to take a side. No more funding universities until they change their culture. No more funding political parties on the left. There is nothing worse than that 1980s hipster billionaire type swanning around in the 2020s. No more Richard Bransons or Simon Holmes courts. We need more Elon Musks. And this was a point that Kisin, I think, made very, very clearly.
And so I say to our friends in the world of business, you've made your fortunes by maximizing your returns on your investments. We are in the fight of our lives. There is no greater return on your investment than to protect and preserve our civilization. And so I invite you to follow in the footsteps of Elon Musk and Paul Marshall and Ben Dello and many of you here who are using your fortunes for the betterment of humanity. I say to our friends in the media, truth matters. We are in the fight of our lives. There is more to life than clicks and downloads. Let's move beyond the culture war where all we do is bat away the litany of slanderous allegations about our history. Let's set the agenda. Let's remind our fellow citizens why we are where we are. Let's remind them that we are the most tolerant, open and welcoming societies in the history of the world. We're not embarrassed about our past. We're proud of it. And to my colleagues in new media especially, I say this. The legacy media is dying for a reason. They cannot be saved. They cannot be reformed. Let's stop complaining about them and start building the media empires of the future ourselves.
Yep, that's what we're doing right here on ADH TV. And he had this message for conservatives and classical liberals that are working as academics and teachers.
I understand that many of you feel like the French resistance or Soviet partisans, stuck behind enemy lines, undermanned and outgunned. And you're right, we are in the fight of our lives. So keep fighting for every young mind you can. It will be worth it. And finally, I say to our friends in politics, many of you here are conservatives. I'm not. I look terrible in tweed. That's why I identify as politically non-binary. But I can tell you conservatives something. You will never get young people to want to conserve a society and an economy that is not working for them. We will not overcome woke nihilism as long as young people are locked out of the housing market, unable to pair up, unable to have kids, unable to plan for the future.
Bingo. It's our number one issue, as I said at the beginning of the show. That's Konstantin Kisin with some very powerful words there at this year's inaugural art conference held last week in London. Lots of fantastic art content available right here on adh.tv. Tell your friends to check it out and download our app. Please download our app and help us build the Aussie media revolution. Well, we Australians need to hope and pray that Israel wins this war in Gaza quickly and things settle down. Why, you ask, does some war in the Middle East affect us? Because Australia relies on its alliance with the United States for its defence. And with wars in the Ukraine and the Middle East already, America can't afford a third geopolitical crisis opening up. Just a couple of weeks ago, President Biden had to warn China not to attack our nearest neighbour, the Philippines, when things got a bit tense in the South China Sea. About 2 weeks ago, Chinese vessels, quote, intentionally hit Philippine boats in the South China Sea. It happened during a Philippine mission to bring supplies to troops that are stationed in the Spratly Islands, territory that the International Court decided does belong to the Philippines many years ago, but which China still claims as its own. The Philippines says a Chinese Coast Guard ship and a militia vessel were undertaking dangerous manoeuvring, leading to a collision with a Philippine resupply boat and a Coast Guard vessel. China says the Philippines was hyping up the incident and spreading false information. But President Biden had to remind China of its treaty commitments to come to the Philippines' aid, that's the US's treaty commitments to come to the Philippines' aid, in the event of any Chinese attack.
I want to be clear. I want to be very clear. The United States defense commitment to the Philippines is ironclad. The United States defense agreement to the Philippines is ironclad. Any attack on the Filipino aircraft vessels or armed forces will invoke our mutual defense treaty with the Philippines.
Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. told Army officer graduates at a ceremony in Manila to be ready to adapt and respond to emerging national defense realities.
Your new positions and ranks shall place you at the forefront, both familiar and new and novel defense and security challenges that we now face. You must not only anticipate, but you must also be ready to adapt and respond to emerging national security and defense realities that exist in our country and in our region.
That's the President of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., speaking to graduating military officers. Again, this matters to Australia because the Philippines and the US are military allies and because of China's continued claims over the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, or what the Philippines might call the West Philippine Sea. Significantly, this week, the Japanese Prime Minister visited the Philippines and both countries pledged their unity on defence. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida addressed the Philippine House of Representatives during his visit to Manila, the Philippines' capital, this week. And he had this indirect but not so subtle reminder for China.
I confirmed with President Marcos during his visit to Japan in February that we would work together to maintain and strengthen the free and open international order based on the rule of law. Furthermore, during my visit to the United States in January, I expressed my strong determination to defend a free and open Indo-Pacific. Underlying this plan is our determination to lead the international community toward cooperation rather than division and confrontation, and to defend freedom and the rule of law at all costs.
That's the Prime Minister of Japan speaking through an interpreter to the Philippines House of Representatives this week about the new strengthened ties between those two countries, allies of Australia, to combat any potential aggression by China in our region. Well, it's no surprise that times are tough. We've talked about it on the show quite a lot, and a very important subject for everyone in small business these days is what to do if you're staring down the barrel of a pretty hefty tax debt after COVID. And with all the inflation and the troubles with the economy right now, you're wondering, God, how am I going to pay this off, and can I keep the business going? There's been a very, very clear change of tune from the Australian Tax Office since July towards small business and towards tradies, and the Tax Office isn't hiding the fact. We're going to have a chat to two experts on the show in a moment about how, if you run a small business or if you're a tradie, how you can protect yourself from the Tax Office's crackdown, and maybe look at other new laws to really help reduce that tax liability and get your business back in the black. So it is really, really an important thing to have a think about, because at the moment, the Australian Tax Office Assistant Commissioner, Gillian Kitto, has just come out and said that during the COVID pandemic, the Tax Office shifted to trying to provide stimulus payments to small business and assistance with tax, but now they're getting tough again. She says it's now time to re-establish the culture of paying tax on time, that we've got to draw a line in the sand to protect the Australian community and other creditors, and to ensure a level playing field for businesses who are doing the right thing, which is sort of fair enough. Now, the Australian Tax Office is actually owed about $33 billion from small business. And since July, they've been issuing notices of intent to tens of thousands of businesses that have got a tax debt of $100,000 or more that's overdue by more than 90 days, basically saying pay up. And if you don't pay up, they're now going to name and shame you, and that could cause all sorts of problems, because you get your debts disclosed to credit rating checking agencies, and it's already been happening. Now, Ms. Kitto told The Australian that the only way to stop a business's tax debt becoming visible in these credit rating checks is to pay up or engage the ATO. And there's many different ways that you can engage the ATO, and I've got two very smart gentlemen here on the other side today to tell us a little bit about that. Bryn, welcome. Bryn Harwood from Tradies Accountants. Very good to have you here, Bryn.
Thanks, Damien. Thanks for having me on.
And also got Roberto Crispino from Hall Chadwick Accountants, and you're a liquidator as well. I'll start with you, Roberto. I mean, people want to stop liquidation, right? We don't want to have people going to the wall. We don't want to see people losing their jobs. What is an SBR, this small business restructuring, this new concept, and what does it mean for small business?
So the SBR regime is a regime where a company can put forward a proposal to its creditors to take a discount on their debts. Now, the SBR regime allows the company to stay in control of its company during this process, and the process that will last for around about 35 business days. During that time, the company can put a proposal, a cents in the dollar return to its creditors for their acceptance. And this regime allows directors to stay in control, put a line in the sand through their debts that have been settled with during the pandemic period, and hopefully keep businesses alive and avoid liquidation, keeping people in jobs.
So, Brendan, there's been a big uptick, right? The number of people coming inquiring about these SBRs, but there's still a lot of people don't even know they exist.
Oh, look, I'd say, yeah, there's a lot of people out there that aren't even aware that the SBR is there. And I think that's part of the problem. So, really raising awareness to say there are other ways to deal with debt. If you've got debt with the ATO, there are options available for you. And what you need to do is really, be speaking to your accountant, engaging with your accountant, and then finding out what these options are.
Yeah, I mean, I had no idea about it. I mean, it's an amazing scheme, really, when you think about it. So you can basically go through that liquidation type process without having to actually go into liquidation. You can keep your business going, negotiate with the tax office. And I guess most of the debt that a lot of people are carrying is with the ATO, right?
It will be. I think, as you mentioned off the top, that the last few years, businesses have been conditioned away from the ATO chasing debt. The ATO sort of shifted their positioning to supporting businesses during a troubled time, and the debts that companies were having, their tax debt increased during that period. Now with the ATO shifting their thoughts, companies need to think about, how do I solve my tax debt issues?
Did they kind of go too far, do you think? Do you think people are got used to the idea that the ATO is not going to bother us too much at the moment because of COVID?
Yeah, I think companies and directors were conditioned to that and trying to do what they could to survive during a really troubling 2 years. And as the Commissioner said recently, that shift in focus has happened quite quickly. Now these are avenues that are available to companies and directors to solve these problems.
Right, that's great. Yeah, so basically how do people go about it? They just should talk to their accountant, I guess.
Yeah, I think, Damien, like the first point of call is to going to your accountant, having a look at your debt and running through the eligibility of it to make sure, obviously, that you're eligible for a small business restructure. And if you are, then that might be an option for you. It might be an option that you can negotiate with the ATO and pay your debt down without having to do this. That might not be an option because, with cost of living and, interest rates have been rising and, a lot of people are struggling out there in the community, and especially business owners.
So what's the criteria that you've got to meet?
So one of the main criteria is your total liabilities needs to be under $1 million.
Right.
You also need to be up to date with all of your tax lodgements.
Right.
And your employee entitlements such as superannuation needs to be paid.
Okay.
So those are the three main criteria to be eligible.
Yeah. So there's no leeway on, you've got to pay your staff, you've got to have your super paid, you've got to have your taxes all lodged, and then you can start this process.
That's right.
But the tax office is pretty keen to help, right? I mean, it's not a complete, we're seeing them saying now, we've got to get back to, people paying their tax on time, and we've got to get back to normal time post-COVID, a normal approach to tax, and keep it fair for everybody, I guess, and look after creditors. But they are supportive of this little window of support.
Yeah, so over the last 18 to 24 months, the ATO has been quite positive with this regime and approving some 93% of proposals put forward. So that's obviously a directive to the tax office to support this regime and all the benefits that come from it.
How bad is it out there at the moment, guys? I mean, what are you feeling like talking to clients now? I mean, everyone's quite worried about cost of living increases and where the economy's at right now.
I think it's tough, Damien. I think it's quite tough out there right now. Like I said before, cost of living's gone up, everything's gone up, nothing seems to be coming back down. Interest rates have gone up. Obviously, there seems to be geopolitical kind of issues that are going on. So I think, in business, confidence doesn't seem to me like it would be really high right now. And, essentially these kind of options that you have are things that, you need to be looking at, you need to be considering if you're in that camp of struggling.
You obviously applaud this particular option as a good one. Is there anything else government could do at the moment, do you think?
It's interesting that I say the SBR regime has had quite good success recently, and there was talk potentially about lifting the eligibility criteria from that $1 million mark, maybe up to $2 million, which would make this regime available to more businesses.
Okay. Do you think the 1 million is too low? Like, is that your personal sort of vibe? I mean, I would have thought that would have captured it would capture most tradies, right, or sole operators. But I suppose it doesn't capture those companies that are employing 10, 15 people.
It's probably about right. In the last 18 months, the average debt that the SBRs have captured is around about that $600,000 level. So it is about right. But as things get more challenging for businesses out there, that might be an avenue the ATO can look at or the government can look at to raise that limit.
Right. How busy are you at the moment, Roberto? This is the concern, right? I mean, how many people are actually going under now? So many small businesses?
So the insolvency appointment numbers have steadied back up to the pre-pandemic levels. Okay. So we are seeing nationally around about 10,000 appointments per annum.
Okay, so that's pre-pandemic levels, so it's not higher than pre-pandemic levels?
No, not yet,
okay.
But it is increasing. So with the SBR numbers, in the first 18 months, there were 82 SBR proposals put forward. The ATO is now seeing 50 per month. So there's a lot
that'll
more
be 600
activity.
a year now, right. So that'll help bring down the number of actual insolvencies, hopefully.
Yes.
Which will make things look better, I guess, from a political point of view for the government. But does it mean the real economy is? How do you think the real economy is compared to pre-COVID levels?
I think there's a lot of hurt out there. There's a lot of people struggling, and I think cost of living is a major one. And there's a lot of people who are saddled with debt that's 3 years old during the pandemic that they weren't able to escape with and are dealing with now on top of cost of living, interest rate rises as well.
But the SBR does give a lot of these business owners a second chance, doesn't it? Where you can kind of go and clear your debt and make this agreement, and then you can keep trading, and from there you could be really successful.
Well, most importantly, you can keep jobs alive, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the most important thing if you're a small employer. And I don't think people realise just what percentage of Aussies work for small business.
No, I think
and
that's
how big an employer that segment is.
I think that's 100% right, because a lot of big companies don't hire as many people in comparison to their revenue. So a lot of these smaller companies hire a lot more people in comparison to their revenue. And so giving these business owners that are have 5 or 10 people employed, giving them a second chance to be able to make good with their debt and then move on and keep trading and supporting the economy and driving growth.
And that's a really important point you make, right? It's the proportionate number of people you hire versus how much money you're bringing into the business, right? Which small business actually puts much more into hiring than big business and corporations do.
That's exactly right. And I don't think that's a secret that, you know, small business are generally the backbone of the economy.
Well, they're more efficient, more lean. They do a lot of the innovation. They do a lot of the breaking through the norms that the big bureaucracies of corporations can't do, or the big bureaucracies of government as an employer can't do. And yeah, it's a very, very important segment of our economy is small business. And it's nice to see, for a change, some policy that backs small business.
Yeah.
You know, rather than the policy we see often with red tape and compliance regulations, it's like, oh, you know, big companies can handle it, right? Because they've got the capacity and the staff and the compliance teams and lawyers and in-house accountants and everything that can manage those big compliance expectations. But your average farmer, your average tradie, your average small business person's like, oh my God, how am I going to keep up with all this red tape or green tape in some cases? I think that firsthand, no doubt, I guess.
Yeah, I think this was a very commercial. It was a very commercial piece of legislation that they've put in place to assist these business owners, and I think they've done a really good job in being able to put this in place, and it's a commercial outcome for all of the stakeholders.
Yeah.
You know.
So it's called Small Business Restructuring, SBRs. Talk to your accountant about it if you think that you might be eligible for this, and you might be surprised. So talk to your accountant about it, even if you have an inkling you might be eligible, because it really is one of these government policies for once that's really looking after small business, which is not something that we see enough of. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming on the other side. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us on board, Damien.
Thanks, Damien. Thanks very much, Bryn. Thanks, Roberto. And that's all we have time for this week on The Other Side Australia. Please like and share and tell your friends about the show. We really do need your support. And that is the best way that you can support us and help us keep the media landscape in Australia more diverse politically and have more diversity of opinion. The only diversity that should really matter. We'll catch you next Friday for your weekly summary catch-up of all the week's news without the woke. I'm Damien Curry. Bye for now.